It's not English, it's Liverpudlian.
Could you please sing something?
No!
How did you find America?
I left to Greenland. No, I'm a mocker.
Welcome to Simple Conversations with ASG.
The people have been asking, was John Lennon in the Illuminati?
What is the Illuminati? Is it real? There's an even bigger, deeper question. I don't think he would have had any trucking with any organisation like that. That's just not his thing. He wasn't a joiner of things. If anything, I think got too formal. He'd won out. That wasn't his thing. And he blew hot and cold with stuff. He went through fads. It could be different types of religion. It could be length of his hair, the design. It could be music. It could be anything. And particularly reading books. He devoured books from when he was a little kid. And so if he got into a subject, he'd buy like 20 books on it, read them all, be fascinated and obsessed with it for a short amount of time. Then you get bored and move on to something else. So I don't ever see him really as a joiner of things.
Why do you think then the like online obsession seems to be that he was some way linked to satanic or the devil or something?
Probably because people are looking for something. I mean, if you follow his whole career and start with his childhood. So he grew up in the Church of England and was actually confirmed into the Church of England, St. Peter's Church, where John and Paul met. So he grew up in the Christian church. Obviously, they explored Eastern religions, but he got very fed up with the Maharishi in Rishikesh in 68, when he thought he was onto something really good with meditation, and then he just saw him as a fraud. And that was just typical of him. Then there's various associations that his wife Yoko then brought in as well. But then we do know, not long before he died, he'd been, obviously he was famous for the Beatles are more popular than Jesus comments.
Yeah.
Back on the US tour. And he actually then said he became a Christian, went to church at Easter and really got back into the Christian church, but then seemed to have moved away from that again. It's hard to know exactly what he was thinking at any particular time because he did move around for different things. But satanic and occultish, I couldn't really comment more on that. I think he would have investigated the occult. He would have read books on that, definitely. But I say he wasn't a committer to things, and he flitted with so many different belief systems. It's hard to know, because of course he was only 40 when he died, to know exactly where he was at that point.
Yeah, there is like kind of like an old legend seems to be around Liverpool where people believe that John Lennon saw some kind of devil figure in Mossley Hill that said, you've got this incredible talent and I can make you famous beyond your wildest dreams. I can make the whole world hear your talent, but you have to pay the price or something. And then obviously it seems to somehow collide with when the Beatles really took a big jump. So people just assume that's what it is. But you mentioned that he's not a big committer to things. How do you think then he committed so long to the Beatles?
Well, two parts. First of all, I've lived in Mossley Hill for the last 36 years, and I've not seen anything satanic.
You sure?
Well, a few Evertonians maybe, but we'll keep off the football.
Yeah, please, just this week.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many myths and these stories, particularly in Liverpool. There's a guy called Tom Slemen who's written, I don't know, hundreds of books on ghost stories, some of which may be partially true. So I do know of that one story, and one of the weirdest ones was that he was playing cricket when he apparently has this encounter, and it would have been Calderstones Park, not far from here, just by his old school. John couldn't have played cricket. His eyesight was appalling. He couldn't see more than about 3 feet in front of him. So he never partook in any ball games. So that legend sort of disappeared at that point. Second part of the question, why was he so committed to the Beatles? It was what he was into. It's from when he was young and rock and roll grabbed him. So that would have been 1956. So he's 15 years old. He had Skiffle, which is what the Quarrymen played, Lonnie Donegan's music, which was a craze only lasted from like 56 to 58. But in 1956 as well, you have Long Tall Sally by Little Richard, Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis. And John says when he first heard Long Tall Sally, it was so great he couldn't speak. Now, I actually got to interview and edit the book for Michael Hill, who was John's friend who played in that record in his house, which is literally just around the corner from where I live. And Michael had played that, and he bought it over in Europe, so it wasn't even available in the UK yet. John went to his house at lunchtime with a couple of friends, and he listened to Long Tall Sally, and John's world was just blown apart. And he said that was just amazing. That's what took him off into music. But would he have done it on his own? Probably not. I think he needed Paul for that, because when John and Paul meet, which is July 57, everything changes. Up to that point, the Quarrymen had been going for about 12 months, and we're a group of friends having fun. When Paul joins, who was a better musician, John needed Paul in the group to make the group better and to achieve his goal of being an Elvis out on front of the stage, being there to impress the girls. He needed Paul to do that. And I think at that point, Paul almost becomes like a musical director. It was always John's group, but Paul was like leading John gently through it. And I think they needed each other to do that. But because John did get bored, I think his biggest problem with the Beatles was that by the time they stopped touring in 66, and they'd only been touring for 3 years, done all these albums, everything John wanted from fame, he didn't get. He thought money would be it, fame would be it, the mania, all the girls, everything. It didn't bring him any happiness. Which I think it happens to a lot of musicians. By 66 and getting to 67, a lot of his initial dream was over. They got bored playing live. They'd had a great time in Liverpool, and particularly in Hamburg, where they played hours and hours, picking all the music they wanted to. And suddenly then, when they go on tour, they're playing like the same 10 songs for 30 minutes. And they were just bored. And so I think then you get to 67 and get into 68. They have the big time off and they go off to Rishikesh. John then meets Yoko. And he's had enough of the Beatles by that point, because Brian Epstein has died in the summer of 67. Also the one who keeps coming up with projects, trying to keep the Beatles together. But by the time you're getting through into 69, they're hardly spending a lot of time together in the studio. They still come up with, the last recorded album, Abbey Road, is still a work of genius. But as a band, they weren't all in the studio at the same time because they were all struggling with relationships between them. So it was naturally coming to an end. So when you boil it down into, really, their fame was 63 to 66, which included touring. And then by the time they split up in April 70, it's only just over 7 years of releasing records and being famous. It's not that great a time period, but they just packed so much into it.
So there's always this dynamic with bands and musicians where a talented musician enters a band, especially back in those times and probably before 2000, where boy bands were more popular, and they assemble that crew around them they are great at the things they're not quite good at, and they don't really want to take the time to learn. Obviously, back then, all the boy bands needed a front man. Maybe wasn't as musically talented as other people, but they brought the energy, they brought the excitement. They were the people people would pay to see just to come out to, because their energy was insane. Robbie Williams talks about it in his movie, where when Gary Barlow started singing alongside him, he almost grew a resentment for him, because Gary was the person in the papers, he was the person in the magazines. They wanted to talk to him because he was the guy getting the crowds going. And there is this speculation a lot online. Obviously, it can't really come to an end because John's not here anymore. But John and Paul really always butted heads. They never fully saw eye to eye because of what you're talking about. John probably didn't feel like he was getting as musically fulfilled from the Beatles as he should have. Do you think that because Paul was the front man and he was the person in the headlines, John kind of resented that because he got on the music for that kind of reason?
No, I don't think so. I think because they needed each other a lot when they started out. They couldn't have done it without each other. And when they did become big, which in the UK was in 63, John was still very much the leader. He was still, if they had one, the front man. He stood on his own. Paul and George were the supporting cast. And Paul didn't have a massive problem with that. They worked so well together. The songwriting in those first few years was pretty equal. I think it's then, as they're starting to do more and more writing alone, and then the other would maybe help finish a song off, that's when the partnership then frays a little bit. But certainly at the beginning, they were best friends. They did so much. I mean, they almost put an end to the Beatles in '61. When John was 21 and he got £100 at his birthday, he decided that he and Paul would just go off and hitchhike into Europe. With leaving Pete Best and George Harrison here in Liverpool, cancelled gigs, and off they went hitchhiking. Ended up in Paris and just stayed in Paris. Ironically, that's where they then got their what became famous mop-top haircuts in Paris at the end of '61. So the two of them were really close. There had been an issue out in Hamburg when Stuart Sutcliffe joined the group, because Stuart became John's best mate, and Paul resented Stuart for that, and he was jealous of that relationship and was partially responsible for encouraging Stuart to leave before he was kicked out. So that then brings John and Paul closer together again. And their songwriting, certainly going through into the early to the mid-60s, that partnership was very important. That then changes really when they stop touring, so not spending as much time together. They're off doing solo projects. And then once Yoko comes into the picture, John, as I was saying, he gets obsessed. He then decides he wants to spend every minute of every day with Yoko. So that's, again, slips in the middle between John and Paul, and that then never healed itself again. So they needed each other, but I think John could operate more on his own. I think Paul needed John more than John needed Paul by then.
Do you think then the other band members, you obviously mentioned a few that they came and went, but Ringo and George obviously stayed most of the test of time. Do you think that they maybe felt like taking a backseat wasn't quite for them, because they obviously broke apart before the Beatles officially kind of went to dust?
Well, I think if you look back, when they signed the first, get the record deal, the first single comes out at the beginning of October '62. At that point, when they signed their proper management agreement with Brian Epstein, they also have John and Paul signing their publishing deal. By doing that, so much of the income for the records is going to John and Paul as joint songwriters, and immediately that relegates George to a lesser role in the group. And of course, Ringo's only just joined a few weeks before. But at that point, 1st of October '62, you're already separating from being 4 of them to being 2 and 2. And George had this problem because he was so young. You know, when he joins, he's only 14 and John was 17. And it took John 2 or 3 times for him to accept George and say, okay, you can join the group, because he was so good on guitar. But that was a big issue, and Paul always treated George like a younger brother. That never improved, as we saw by the time they're doing the Let It Be sessions, and George has had enough. And he's just fed up of being spoken to like the kid and being told how to play guitar, even though George was a better guitarist than John or Paul. And he says, I've had enough, see you around the clubs, and off he goes. Ringo was different because George had been in the Quarrymen from the end of 1957. There was a long history of John, Paul and George together. Ringo only joins in August '62, just before the first record comes out. So he doesn't have that backstory with the other three. And by his personality, he was always happy just to sit at the back. And that's one of the great things about his drumming style, was that he knew how to play the right rhythm for the right song. He never wanted to dominate with the drums. And one of his great phrases was, just because there's a moment of silence doesn't mean it needs to be filled. And that's why he was such a popular drummer, and people tried to emulate everything that he did. So he tended to be the peacemaker. But even he's had enough when they're making the White Album. And he's just, because he was bored, because they're not touring. And so the others, they sit around in the studio for hours and hours, days and days on end. And he'd take a book to read, or he'd go and play chess, or to go off and do something, because he wasn't needed for ages. And he just thought, what's the point of doing this? And off he went, and he quit, but then was brought back in. So you could tell, really, from the end of '67, after Brian dies, that's when everything started to get fractured. And really, that's the beginning of the end. Even though he didn't realise it at the time, when you look back, you can see that's when everything sort of goes downhill.
Yeah, I do want to talk about Ringo, how he left first, but I will come back to George in a second. Is it true that Ringo left? Obviously, have you just explained that he wasn't really needed a lot closer to the end, but is it true that he kind of felt like he wasn't wanted as well, to a degree?
Yeah, I think he always had that problem because he'd come into it so late. I think he said it took him about 12 months after joining to finally feel part of the group. And the best thing for Ringo was doing that first US tour, going on the Ed Sullivan Show. And I think that American tour made Ringo, because over here, they knew where he'd come from. He was in another group, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Whereas in America, it didn't matter. Because for a lot of them, all that mattered was John, Paul, George and Ringo had landed in America, and they were the Beatles. He never had to explain anything back then. And suddenly, his personality comes through, and he's very much one of the four. And that was the best thing for him. That's when they really gelled, was using that tour. But I think what one of his problems was, and he'd explained this, when he was the mediator. If there was a scrap between two of the others, he would normally be the one to go and try and fix it. And there's one occasion when he was going around to the others, and they all said the same thing. I thought it was you, it wasn't me. And they were all making assumptions that someone else was the problem, and none of them had got it right. And it's just because they weren't spending that time together, and because there was no pressure. I think this is probably, as a musician as well, they felt it. When you're doing those first albums, because they were touring, everything was getting fitted in, so it meant you had to be really disciplined. Suddenly then, at the end of '66, there's no more touring. And of course, here am I saying, well, Abbey Road's yours. Spend as long as you want, months if you want to, making an album. And that problem then, when you got multi-tracking, you don't need all four of them in the studio at the same time. And therefore, there's less and less for Ringo to do. So I think he got fed up with that. And because Paul could play drums, and with Ringo out of the group, he does play on a couple of the songs on the White Album, plays drums. And unless you know to listen for it, you wouldn't know. If you do know what you're listening to, you can tell Paul's not as good a drummer as Ringo. But not many people listen to the songs for the drums, so they could sort of get away with it. So Ringo was always thinking, because Paul would tell him what to do. Right, I'm playing this song, I want this the type of rhythm I want you to do. And I suppose after a while, he's thinking, well, if you know what you want to do, you can do it. And off he went. And it didn't help, because again, it's this period, you've gone past the mid-60s, they've been experimenting with all kinds of different substances, as well as liking a smoke and a drink. And it's just this weird bubble that they were living in. And if suddenly he feels that he wasn't needed, what's my incentive? I've got lots of money. I'm happy, I've got my family, I'll go in there. And he went off onto Peter Sellers' boat in the Mediterranean. This is all right. I could do some of this.
Flip back now to George, because he left as well. But from what I've gathered doing like the research on it, I could tell right away George and Paul had this little like tension type of thing brewing. And I can see what you mean by it started with Paul, probably an unfamiliar situation where somebody's kind of been taken away from him, but it did look like George grew into it as well, and it almost became like a massive tug of war game. But George has been quoted saying that he left due to the constant cameras being around him, and he didn't like the fact his privacy was stripped. But there's also other reports saying that he and Paul actually had a fight, and in the heat of it, George said, right, I'm not doing this anymore, and quit. Are they both true, or is one of them complete bullshit?
No, it's that, and there's more to it as well. So if you watch the Disney Plus, the Get Back series that came out a couple of years ago, because we had 7 or 8 hours of footage, you could see it unraveling, but you still didn't see everything, because the way that was staged and edited, it was Paul trying to tell George to play the guitar in one particular way, and George saying, look, you just tell me what you want me to play, I'll play it that way, or I won't play at all. Whatever it is, I don't care. And he starts getting at you, and I'm not saying that, and tensions rise, and then George said, right, that's it, I've had enough, and off he walks. What you miss is there had been, I think possibly the day before, an argument with John over Yoko. And I think that had happened at George's house. And there'd been a big falling out there. And there'd been words said. So there'd already been words between George and John. That's then followed up by Paul trying to tell George how to play guitar. And George rightly saying, I got into this group because I could play guitar better than you. And I'm still better than you. But Paul wanted to be the musical director. And because he could play a bit of everything, he wanted everybody to play what he wanted. And George had just had enough. He'd had enough years of all that. And again, like I was saying with Ringo, by this point, we're at the beginning of 1969. They'd had all the years. They'd not been touring for ages. They'd been off doing different projects, which they were probably enjoying on their own. And the bit they weren't enjoying was coming back together. And the pressure then of doing all these sessions, trying to start songs and a whole album from scratch with cameras on you the whole time, is just not a nice experience. And it would never have bothered Paul, because he was good with doing stuff like that. John, not bothered in the least. I think George is more private, and I think also he took his musicianship more seriously, and he would hate the thought that he was making mistakes and that was being filmed and people could see it. Because that's what happens when you're with a band and you're learning together, you're going to make loads of mistakes. And it sounds like a nice idea, but if you're really proud of your reputation as a great guitarist, as he was, he wouldn't want people to see that. And so when you put all those pressures together, all under the gaze of all these cameras and microphones hidden everywhere, picking up every little thing, it was too much. And he thought, no, I'm not doing this anymore. And off he went.
George is what of a different kind of character to the rest. They all kind of have standout personality traits, but George seems to be this person that headstrong, driven, dedicated. But then you hear about an addition to the room he made in Hamburg. Can you please go through this? Because I'm going to butcher this if I try and explain, because I can't get it in my head at all.
So when he first went out there, which was August 1960, the place they were playing was the Indra Club. And the guy who owned the Indra Club, Bruno Koschmider, he'd arranged for them to go out there and play. And they were playing every night, 6 to 8 hours. They thought they'd be staying in a hotel. They weren't. What they were given was 2 dingy rooms at the back of a cinema with virtually no light. And you could hardly see anything in there. They didn't take much with them. And for most of the first few weeks, they didn't leave the confines of the Grosse Freiheit, which was the street they were on. So where they were staying, you literally crossed the road, went 50 yards, and that was the club. So that's all. They just stayed around there. And they were keeping weird hours as well. So of course, because they started playing early evening, and that could be going through into the early hours. And then, as they soon found out, naturally, they got very, very tired. So they were given these, it's like it was a slimming pill called the Pralidin, Prallies as they were known. And so you'd have one of those and it would give you energy. But by giving you energy, it made you thirsty. So you need to drink more. And all the drink available was alcohol. So you got this mix going on through the whole night. And then you get back to your bedroom and you couldn't really see what was going on. And sometimes you would feel sick. And so he vomited. I thought, well, I'm not clearing that up. Well, I'm not clearing that up either. and so nobody cleared it up, and it was added to, and it just became part of the furniture, this little mountain of vomit. Some of the stories, when you listen to them, of the rooms they were staying in, because the beds weren't comfortable, it was freezing cold. They had no bathroom, so they had to use the ladies' toilets behind the cinema to get washed in. And one of the famous things was George, you been there, a young 17-year-old when he went out there, and they were all teasing him because he hadn't lost his virginity. So an arrangement was made, and in the darkness of the room, George gets his girl, and at the end, they all stood around and shouted, cheered, and applauded. So they got up to all sorts there, and it was your classic rock and roll story. You know, it's a terrible digs to live in. It was a shocking place. But because they were so young, it was so much fun, because they were let loose in the fleshpot sex city capital of Europe. It was nothing compared to Liverpool. It was so different. Neon light strip shows, everything going on. They had no idea. I think Paul said in one polite BBC interview, and said, you know, and it looked like fun, and we had some fun. And it was the kind of thing, young lads out there let loose. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll and stuff, and they had such a good time. I'm thinking of George. You know, for George, it was all about the music, and he said, as the Beatles, their best time for playing live was 1961 at the Top 10 Club in Hamburg, and they played for 92 nights consecutively. But they could pick whatever songs they wanted to do. He said, and we'd learned by then how to entertain a crowd. We were so tight as a band, and the PA system and stuff was state of the art. So that's when we were at our best. And I think that's what upset him the most with touring. Because in Hamburg, they'd grown as musicians so quickly to be so good and better than any other band in Liverpool. And then all that musical development is then stunted and almost stopped, because you're just flying around places playing the same boring 10 songs, and people can't hear you because all the girls are screaming. And as a musician, when you're on stage, you feed off the crowd. And if all they're doing is screaming and not listening to you, what's the point of doing any of this? And I think that was the biggest problem for George, was stopping touring, because he was always just about the music. That's what was important to him. And if you're not touring and you're not progressing, then he would then try and develop himself, but by doing that in his own home studio. And again, that's the issue we were talking about before. They got so much money. They got these massive big houses, and each one's got its own home studio. So they're learning stuff on their own and then bringing it in, but you're not growing and developing as a group.
Some of their stories are insane, and there are a couple ones I've picked on that I want to talk about at the end. But you've mentioned there in that story that they were the biggest band in Liverpool, and I think people don't. I've seen it online a lot, and people that I spoke to that know about the Beatles and stuff seem to don't understand the fact that they were so young when they became the biggest band in the UK. Like, all these stories are going to be from different countries around the world, a lot of them in America because they spent a lot of time there, but they didn't do that just because they were popular. They done it because there was the only place they could get competition. Like, in the UK, there was no one even touching them, even at a young age. These things, like you say, like, oh, no, they had a lot of fun, they done a lot of things and stuff. Whenever you look back, even now on the videos, them talking in America and stuff, a part of why they were so popular is they were just so normal Scouse lads. Like, they were just 17-year-olds running wild. Like, do people looking back now understand just how big they were on a worldwide basis, not just the UK?
I think that's that they're seen as a worldwide phenomenon, you know, as the biggest band ever. And one thing that I like to do, because I also act as a tour guide, and I have done for many years, taking people around Liverpool and telling them all these great stories. And when I was researching my first book over 20 years ago now, I wanted just to plot the number of different venues that they played in across Merseyside. And I got to, and it's about 110. different venues they played in, and quite often they were playing 3 times a day. So they play at the Cavern at lunchtime for an hour, and then early evening they play somewhere else locally, and then they come back into Liverpool and close at the Cavern. So people think, because they're so used to, I lose track of what these things are, Britain's Got Talent and X Factor, Pop Idol things, that if you've got a bit of talent, you go on TV and you can get a deal. These lads worked hard. They weren't just lucky. You always need a little bit of luck, but they had the hard work, the hundreds and hundreds of hours that they put in. As the famous book talks about putting your 10,000 hours in to be an expert at something. That's what the Beatles did. They're one of the examples in that book, because that's what they did. They served their apprenticeship going around Liverpool and around Hamburg until they were so good. If Brian Epstein hadn't come along and was able to get them out of Liverpool, they would have packed in, because there was no competition left by the end of 1961. They were so far ahead of everybody else. They had to go to London. They had to get a record deal, or that would have been it. And every company turned them down until George Martin gave them that audition. So it was that close to it not happening, and the world never seeing who the Beatles were.
So it's insane to think of that as a hypothetical. I mean, I noticed whenever you were telling the stories of the conflict in the group and the 2 members leaving, it seems to kind of revolve around, I don't know if this is the right way to explain it, but it's how I'm thinking in my head, that they almost had an element of boredom, because they were so famous, they were so successful, but they kind of had nothing else to do. Do you think if they continued touring, maybe not at the volume they were originally, but if they continued doing occasional tours, they would have stayed together?
I think that would have helped, definitely. Because they had no discipline, and particularly after Brian had died, they could do whatever they wanted. And sometimes that's a bad thing. And I think every artist or band needs a strong producer. Well, thankfully they had George Martin to do that. But even then, the 4 of them thought they were good enough to bring somebody else in. And they all did projects where they were producing somebody else. And they didn't have anybody who could say, no, stop, sit down, shut up. You're not doing that. This is what we're doing. I think that's what they really, really needed. And they wouldn't have any other manager than Brian. And when Brian died, then they haven't got his leadership. That's when the dynamic in the band then changes, because Paul is the one who's trying to find projects to keep them going. But then he's taking on a different kind of leadership role, which then comes into conflict with John. So the balance has gone within the group. I think it would have helped for Brian. Brian felt as if a big part of his role, of course, was organising the tours. Once they stopped touring, a large part of his job was gone. So he was feeling left out and a little bit useless. So I think if they'd have done some touring and tried to take some of those songs, like on, by the time you get into Revolver, getting a lot more complex, because that album only comes out just before they finish touring. And I think they would have loved the challenge then of trying to take the more complicated music on the road. How would they have done it? And I think particularly from George's point of view, and Ringo's probably as well, they wanted that discipline of playing, because that makes you better as a musician. It's having that time to rehearse is one thing. One of the great things I get to do now, the last couple of years, I've been playing with some of the members of the original Quarrymen. And because we're scattered around the country, we've only had one sort of rehearsal. Most of our rehearsal happens in a sound check or playing live. But the more we've played live together, the better we've become. And as a musician, that pushes you, because you're not just doing it where you can do 100 takes of something on a recording machine. If you've got to do something live, you don't get a chance to get it wrong. You have to concentrate. And as a musician, that really pushes you. And I think that challenge would have helped them all if they could have just have done some performances. And that's why they started getting excited. The whole Let It Be project, the idea was they were going to come together create this album, and then go and do a big performance somewhere. That's really what they were buying into. The problem was where they were going to perform, and they were looking at places, playing out by the pyramids, going on a cruise ship somewhere, a Roman amphitheater. They didn't think of anything, something iconic, something big. But that kept them going, was the idea of, we've got to be good enough to perform this live. And I think when you see the rooftop performance that they do, which becomes so iconic, instead of flying up around the world, they're just on the roof of their building. You can see them enjoying it because they had to push themselves. It was that discipline. Suddenly it was, here's a calendar. We've got 1 month. We've now got to write songs, arrange them, record them, and then perform them. And suddenly the pressure was on. And I think that was the best thing for them. And I think you made a very good point. If they had toured for a bit longer, I think that would have helped them.
This is quite a controversial question I'm going to ask. And
I'll take a sip of water. Come on then.
I'm only asking because you've mentioned the Quarrymen a few times, and I've done some research on them, but I've kind of been puzzling this in my head, and I don't know maybe if there's a reason, nobody's asked it, but if you could swap members of the Quarrymen for members of the Beatles, do you think there's a combination that would make the Beatles more successful?
This has been cleared up very, very nicely by Paul recently. So Colin Hanson, who's the original drummer in the Quarrymen, has written a book doing his story, and it's been made into a documentary. And I've just seen the finished documentary. It's really good. And Paul has recorded an interview for it. And he said, you don't look at it as two separate groups. The Quarrymen were the early Beatles. It's an evolution. See, it wasn't, here's a group called the Quarrymen. They split up. And then these other guys get together and form the Beatles. It goes all the way through. So John starts it in 56. Meets Paul in July 57. George joins in December 57. Most of the other group members of the Quarrymen have left, but Colin, the drummer's still there, right through to March 59. When he quits, they then get another guitarist, Ken Brown. So you still got John, Paul and George together. And then you get into 1960 and Stuart Sutcliffe joins, and then they start getting the drummers and becoming a rock and roll group in May 1960. 3 months later, with Pete Best, they're off to Hamburg. It's an evolution. There was never just a Quarrymen and then a Beatles. And one of the books that I wrote, 2013, it came out, called The Fab 104. I've got 104 people involved in the story of the Beatles by the end of 1962, which involves over 40 different musicians, different groups that they backed, singers that they backed, other people who taught them to play, contributed to the group. And the whole book is the evolution of the Beatles from the Quarrymen through to getting to be the Fab Four in 62. So I just think that is the best way to look at it. John is the consistent all the way through that. It's everybody else who's coming and going and joining and adding and swapping. And it always seemed when the group needed to make the next step up, they found the right person. So the Quarrymen, John's first lineup, they got so far, but musically they couldn't progress from where they were. So Paul comes along and joins. And then Paul realizes he's not a lead guitarist and says to John, but I know a lad who is. So Paul then brings George in. So whenever they need the next level up, they found the right person. So I could never see it as there's one group of musicians and there's another group of musicians. It's a continuity all the way through.
You mentioned Brian Epstein at the beginning, and I did want to touch on him. I was going to bring up the whole controversy around what actually happened to him, but I think it's a little bit unfair the more I read into it. But there is one thing that I do actually want to get your opinion on about Brian's affiliation with the Beatles. Through reading it, he seemed to have been, I don't know if this is the right way to explain it, but he seemed to be the person that kept them grounded. He always let them know whenever they were getting too far ahead of themselves or when they were losing sight of what they were there to do. Do you think that if they had hired someone else as their manager instead of Brian Epstein, they would have been as successful?
It's like I was just saying before. He was the perfect person. In 1960, they had Alan Williams and his friend Lord Woodbine. The two of them were managing the Beatles at the beginning and got them going. For a lot of 61, Pete Best's mum, Mona Best, is then managing the Beatles. Sam Leach, as a promoter, had offered to manage the Beatles, but couldn't do it. And then Brian comes along, and Brian was the perfect person. And they always got the right person at the right time. And without Brian, they couldn't have got out of Liverpool, because he was in the record retail trade. And it was his contacts as being a record retailer that got him into the recording companies. And so without Brian, they wouldn't have got to be in front of George Martin. Now, I think it was key. They needed Brian and George Martin between them, because George Martin they respected so much. And he was very much involved, almost as, I think, probably the guy considered to be the fifth Beatle, because George Martin was involved in the arrangement, in the music, and of the sound, and did the business behind them. But they respected him. They laughed and joked with him. And I think Brian maybe didn't feel as appreciated as he actually was, because he was so essential, and they would never have had another manager. He'd even talked about bringing somebody else in, Robert Stigwood, to work with him, and they said no. They only wanted Brian. And I think he had that gravitas as a manager and their respect. So if he then said to them, hang on, lads, no, this is what we're doing, they would argue, but they'd listen.
Right. Got 10 quick fire questions for you here, and things have been roaming around my head that I couldn't form into real questions. I just write them down. So I'll start with the first one. Did the Beatles actually gamble with Elvis?
What, and win or lose?
No, well, the story is apparently they played roulette with him in his house in Bel Air. Is that true?
Yeah, they did. And they played, I think they played a bit of pool as well. And then a couple of the guitars got out and they had a little jam session and stuff. And it was the coming together of the greatest artists of the 20th century, the greatest solo performer and the greatest group. The problem was, it's weird with the timing, because John wanted to be Elvis. Elvis was king for all of them. Then, of course, by 1960, he's been off in the army, come back, and he's into the movies. They didn't like the music that came out of him. They loved all that early stuff. So by the time they're meeting up, then some of the shine had gone. But having spoken to some of the people who were there, they said suddenly that it was almost like that there was an awe and a shock. Right, now we're here, what do we do? Then the ice gets broken, and that was it. And they were off and chatting away and stuff, and got on really well together.
The next one is, did the Beatles actually smoke weed with Bob Dylan?
Well, the story is always that Dylan introduced them to weed. And as a more regular thing, yes, he did. But they first encountered the old marijuana back in 1960 in Liverpool. They were hanging out in the black clubs of Liverpool, where there's a lot of the Caribbean community who did like to partake of the weed, and that's where they first came across it and tried it early on. I think the meeting with Dylan changed it. And again, having spoken to a couple of the journalists who were around at the time, said walked into the room and said it's just this cloud that you walked into. So yes, there was a fair amount consumed, and had done for many, many years afterwards.
Another smoke-related question, but did the members of the Beatles really smoke hundreds of cigarettes a day?
George was a chain smoker. He was terrible for it, but they did smoke a lot of cigarettes. They really did. I think George was the worst out of all of them. You put one down, next one would be in. Yeah, it was not healthy at all, unfortunately.
Was the song Lady Madonna about an actual person?
Unlikely. The problem is, with a lot of the songs, Paul's told different stories at different times, and we keep getting different elements of it. like with Eleanor Rigby, we finally got, we think, all the different elements to tell the whole of that story together. I think for Lady Madonna, it was more as a tribute to seeing what his mum had to do. And of course, she features in Let It Be as well. And it's these amazing mothers who managed to do a job, run a house, bring up a family, all on their own. So I think that it's a coming together of the ideal of the mum, but a bit of a tribute to his mum, Mary, as well.
I can't believe I'm going to ask this, but
Come on.
why do people believe the Beatles only wrote songs about prostitutes and lesbians?
Where have you got that one from?
There's an interview in America where one of the reporters asked, I think he might ask George a question about a song where George mentions something about paying a woman or something, and Paul McCartney screams over the top, it's because whenever we're writing our songs, in our heads is the image of prostitutes and lesbians.
Anything like that was going to be their memories of Hamburg. Because for the first time during this, let's say, this sex capital of Europe, where anything happened, live sex on stage, you name it, first time they encounter prostitutes, naked ladies in the window, transvestites, anything. They'd never seen anything like that in their lives. And I think for George to say he was this innocent 17-year-old kid when he went out there, but none of them really had great sexual experience before going to Hamburg anyway. And suddenly they had all this freedom to go and experiment. And it must have been almost as mind-blowing as them taking the first LSD trip. And I think that those kind of experiences at that age, I don't think ever left them. So whatever they went on to do, they still had. It's one of those, I remember saying this, I interviewed Pete Best a few years ago and said to him, so go on, Pete, tell me about Hamburg. And whenever you mention Hamburg to any of the musicians who went over there, they have what I call the Hamburg smile. You think, okay, you're going to tell me 5% of what you know, but your smile's telling me the rest. There's just, they'd all had all these experiences as teenagers, and they would just go back to this place and wow, we actually did that.
These last four are a little bit more serious, and I'm going to leave one that's going to upset a lot of people. The first of the four is, were the living members of the Beatles actually invited to Paul McCartney's wedding?
Which wedding? So you're talking about when he marries Linda?
Yeah, because there was controversy over why they never attended.
Yeah, it was done quite quickly, and by then, I think that was one of those signs that they were drifting apart. Because of course, Paul gets married, John and Yoko then suddenly are scrabbling around trying to find someone to get married as well. It was that kind of competition, and because Yoko was now in the mix, and that was becoming very uncomfortable. I think it was one of those sure signs that the division was there, and because otherwise you would have your best mates would be there at your wedding. And I think by then you could tell things were not good, which is, yeah, shame. It's just another symptom of what was going on.
Did John Lennon say cranberry sauce or berry Paul?
Cranberry sauce.
It still gets waved around everywhere. That Beatles Reddit I was on today, I saw some threats to people's lives over this. Like, this is still huge debate. Like, it's insane.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
So there we go. We say cranberry sauce.
Yeah.
Second last one, which is one I didn't read into because I need you to explain it to me, because you know more than people online. Why, in God's name, do people believe Paul McCartney died in a car accident? That is the most random story I've ever seen.
Oh, it's brilliant. You can have so much fun. Once it had come out, it's a radio DJ, I think, who'd come up with it and started the story. And because you don't have social media like we do now, it was in those days when if it came through a newspaper or a radio show, it was assumed it was honest. Obviously, we know since then that fake news and everything. But so the news came out, and then it's word of mouth. And suddenly this word is that Paul's been killed and has been replaced by a double, and you can tell because, and that's the rabbit hole you go down. You start looking for all the clues. It's so much, you can have so much fun with it. And once the Beatles knew that this was going on, they played into it as well. I mean, the whole thing with the Abbey Road crossing, with John the Undertaker, Paul hasn't got his shoes on, therefore he's yeah. The registration number of the Volkswagen Beetle on the cover of Abbey Road. It's the age that Paul was. It's like anything. If you want to go and find something, you will just dig and dig until you find something that justifies whatever it is you're trying to create. That one, and it still rumbles on. It's fun. It is so much fun. Unfortunately, though, it is true.
Right. Last one, and
Last one.
I've put it the last one because I know some people are going to fucking hate me for asking this, but with all the big excitement and everybody's loving, seeing the two brothers back together, but with this whole hype over the Oasis reunion, can you finally please tell these people, are the Beatles bigger than Oasis, and would their reunion blow it out of the water? If they were still alive, all of them.
There will never be a band, an artist in history who could blow the Beatles out of the water. And it's like the film Yesterday. No, one of my favourite scenes in Yesterday, when the guy's woken up and nobody seems to know who the Beatles are. And then he goes to Google and puts in Oasis and nothing crops up. And I go, love it. That's one of the best lines in there. I think it's brilliant. Because they were so influenced by the Beatles. And also, which a lot of people don't realise, but a lot of the inspiration for their first album came because they were hanging out in Liverpool with a Liverpool band called The Real People, who helped them a lot with their first album. So a lot of Oasis' first album is very much inspired in Liverpool and from Liverpool musicians. And when the Beatles played in Manchester, they played at the Oasis Club. Connection? So no. So I'm going to an Oasis gig because I never saw them first time round, which I'll enjoy, but you can't mention any other band anywhere near where the Beatles are for what they did, for what they achieved. Because virtually every other band you followed is only there because of what they did first. And for me, if you do it first, then you're the ones.
I'm going to give you the floor now, David, to promote this new book of yours and tell people where they can find you. What are you doing at the moment? What have we got coming up? Okay, so a new book just out called The Beatles What If, and we've looked at quite a few of the scenarios we've been talking about here. A friend of mine, Andrew Phillips, we picked out 70 key moments in Beatles history and looked at what would happen if it went slightly differently. Would that have been the end of the story? Would things have worked out differently? So what if they didn't go to Hamburg? Well, Hamburg's where they learned to be a band. They wouldn't have progressed. That probably would have been the end. What if they don't meet Brian Epstein? Well, they don't get out of Liverpool, so we don't hear about them. One more interesting one is, what if they went to the Decca audition and Decca Records signed them instead of turning them down? So they still would have had some success, but they would never work with George Martin. Can you imagine how different the albums would have been? So that's what we've done. So all the way through, right through to the end, with the biggest one, of course, what if they don't break up? Now, what if they go off and do their own solo projects, but then come together and make a Beatles album and then go off again? So we've come up with, I think, 3 albums. We're picking the best of some of their solo songs and creating a new Beatles album. So it's great. So for once we can say there's a Beatles book with no definitive answers, because we say this is what did happen. What if this happened? This is what we think is the likely outcome. You're there to disagree if you want to. So it's starting discussions everywhere. So it's literally just come out at the end of last month. And so you can find out about that and the rest of my books and everything else I do at davidabedford.com. Nice and simple. All the links are on there. YouTube channel. So you go and see what Liverpool's like. I've made lots of videos about, just walking around Liverpool, telling you some of the Beatles stories from there. Got my own podcast that I do.
all kinds of stuff. So yeah, davidabedford.com. That's where I am.